So following my last video about a cop in Mesa, Arizona who was recently acquitted of all criminal charges after basically murdering a guy in cold blood, on the flimsiest of pretexts. What about cops in general? Aren't they a useful institution? Aren't they serving and protecting? Aren't they a necessary feature of let's say, a diverse multicultural society? Aren't they part and parcel of life in a diverse multicultural society? Well, yes and no. Police certainly perform necessary and helpful functions. Now, it doesn't necessarily follow that they are a necessary and helpful institution. But it also doesn't follow that in your own personal life, you're under any obligation to regard them as friends or allies or, anything other than a source of risk and nuisance. And there's a great video on YouTube about why talking to cops can never benefit you, can only harm you. Like, there's no reason to ever talk to them because nothing you say to them can ever help you out. It can only, even if you're innocent of any crime or anything like that, it can only hurt you to talk to them. It can never help you. It can never leave you better off than if you simply didn't talk to them or didn't engage with them. So there's a powerful individual rationale for avoidance and for suspicion and for, not interacting with them any more than you absolutely have to, not saying anything to them any more than you absolutely have to. But even as an institution, it doesn't follow that just because they perform necessary functions or helpful functions that they're a necessary or helpful institution, because there are other organs within society that could be vested with those functions. And so, the fact that we have a class of paid violent enforcers, they're going to have their own class interests. They're going to have their own institutional interests. And those may only tangentially line up with your own. So, for me personally, I kind of like the militial model, where it's a responsibility that's distributed and everyone has a share in it. And, that way that function is not divorced from everyday life or from everyday individuals, but is, something that everybody shares a part in. And that produces less, I think, conflict of class interests than creating a separate class that's empowered with special rights and special functions above and beyond what everybody else enjoys. So, why is it dangerous to have this class? Well, first of all, they're going to necessarily have a lot of interactions with the criminal justice system. They're going to be in and out of court all the time. They're going to know the judges. They're going to know the prosecutors. They're going to know each other. And so, it wouldn't be surprising at all if a degree of professional courtesy arises among them and among those other classes that are participants in that criminal justice system. And so, if that kind of professional courtesy arises, an example of this would be what people refer to as the blue wall of silence among cops who are reluctant to testify against one another or to take action against one another. That could extend to prosecutors or judges if they are having regular and positive interactions. And there's certainly very little evidence against the proposition that it does, right? There is seemingly a lack of accountability, or at least criminal accountability for wrongdoing among police officers in the discharge of their ordinary duties, no matter how out of line they get, no matter how hard they fuck up. It doesn't seem like they really face consequences unless it's way beyond clear cut. Unless it's just so gross and heinous that there's no possible way around it, and even sometimes then, there's no accountability. When I was a huge libertarian fag, and I was. I was really into the anti-cop stuff. And I kind of chilled out on it a lot because, once the BLM stuff took off, I saw how dishonest they were being with that narrative, and it kind of took the wind out of my sails a little bit. And also, when you have, let's say, violent, racially motivated thugs running around executing cops in the streets, and, their racial animus is directed specifically towards me and towards people who look like me, it's like, do I really want, or do I really trust them to stop there, even if I don't particularly like the guys they're offing now? Like, do I really trust them to stop there? No, I don't. Cops, whatever their issues, whatever the conflicts of interest, they're fairly predictable. You can basically comprehend their motivations, and for the most part, avoid, most of the trouble you could get into with them. Their behavior is fairly predictable. Now, not always predictable, like in Mesa, Arizona. Sometimes they just do really bizarre and irrational stuff. And so, it's not completely predictable, but, they seem to be a little bit more regular and a little bit more predictable than, racially motivated terrorists. So, if you have to choose between one or the other, then, cops are maybe the safer choice there. And so that's an example of how violent instability, in this case surrounding a racial narrative, pushed by people with racial animus and racial grievances, can increase demand for authority. Can increase demand for, arbitrary authority, which is what cops represent. So, anything like that, whether it's Islamic terrorism or criminal outgroups or, just troublesome diversity, all of that can increase demand for authority. Other things that can do it would be rampant vice. And so libertarians are really shooting themselves in the foot here when they try to defend and rationalize and license vice. Like drug dealing and prostitution and other things that people find unpleasant or distasteful and don't want to have around. Right? So the more that you have around, the more demand there is for an authority to come in and break it up, an arbitrary authority. And so, by attempting to license or to rationalize degeneracy, basically, and vice, libertarians are really increasing the demand for arbitrary and violent authority. And so, their priorities are working at cross purposes there. But, there are some other problems as well. Cops are, on the whole, low IQ, low status goons. And investing the violent enforcement mechanism of society in a class of low IQ, low status goons is problematic, because then it means a lot of men who have to interact with them will be humiliated and will consider it an indignity. And it's emasculating having to bend the knee to people who are your social and intellectual inferiors in many ways. And there's a famous case in Connecticut where an officer candidate was rejected because he scored too high on an IQ test, and he sued, and I don't know how many levels of court he went through, but the discrimination was upheld, on the grounds that intelligence isn't a disadvantage but an advantage, so it's okay to discriminate against it. And their rationale was sound, which is that someone of high intelligence is likely to get bored and frustrated with the job and be a source of high turnover, costly turnover. So, low status, low intelligence, some of them are ridiculously overpaid, but, status is not proportional to pay necessarily. Plumbers are well paid, they're not particularly high status. And so having to bend the knee to low social status goons, you know, dumb, drooling, knuckle-dragging, mouth-breathing goons, you know, tremendously humiliating and emasculating. And so if you had, you know, more of a militial system where you can preserve your, you know, let's say status distinctions and class distinctions, and even higher status individuals taking a greater role in that, like in formerly under aristocracy, then, you know, even if you have to bend the knee, it's not as humiliating, because at least it's to somebody above you. You know, furthermore, having that specialization concentrated in a class of low status goons, you know, violence and danger are tremendously attractive to women, for example. And there's some documentation of this you can find in The Murderer Next Door by David Boos. He talks about some about how women are attracted to violence and danger. And, you know, likely that's an evolutionary adaptation. If there's violent and dangerous people about, the safest thing to be, if you're a woman, and that's not, you know, against the law or whatever, as it wasn't in our evolutionary past, then, you know, the safest thing to do is to tend and befriend, or to become useful to those people, or valued to those people, rather than not. So, you know, danger and violence, tremendously attractive to women. They can't indulge it in legitimate society except with low-status goons. And so, you know, they might be more liable to get involved with criminals. You know, people from the criminal underworld, or, you know, hostile aliens, or whatever the case may be, to indulge that, those desires. Whereas if you have that distributed more throughout the legitimate social structure and political structure, then, you know, that wouldn't be as problematic. So, yeah, you know, a lot of problems with cops in general. You know, there's definitely a demand for them, and that's probably an unavoidable consequence of multiculturalism and some of the other changes in society over the last century, and particularly half century. You know, I'd love to get back to a homogenous, high-trust society where all we need is Andy Griffith. And, you know, he's taking the bullets away from Barney because he's too gung-ho. You know, that would be great. But, you know, it doesn't seem in the short term that that's plausible or possible. You know, especially if we're committed to things like diversity and, you know, inclusion and tolerating Islamic extremists and all sorts of other things like this. You know, you really need a much larger and more professional enforcer class under those assumptions, which I don't think those assumptions are necessary, but some people think those assumptions are necessary. And so, you know, it's hard to escape demand for that institution and that class of enforcers under those assumptions, and those assumptions will only tend to increase demand for that. But, you know, I don't think it's good. I don't think any of it is good. And, you know, I'd love to get back to a world where we need a lot less of that, or even none at all, if we can distribute those functions, because there is a necessary violent enforcement function in any social or political order. And if we could distribute that more to normal people, you know, and this is how policing started out, as I understand, which is that they were originally just paid to do things that anybody could do. And the only difference was they were paid to do it full time. And that was their professional function. But, you know, if some normal guy had been responding to a situation in a hotel where there was some alleged hanky-panky going on, and he comes out with an assault rifle and makes somebody run through a ridiculous exercise, and shoots him if he screws up, you know, that would never hold up in court. That dude would be convicted. But, you know, we give cops, and I think necessarily give cops, a lot more benefit of the doubt, because it's their job to respond to situations like that. So it's harder to question them about, well, why were you there? Why were you doing that? and normal people we could question.